Hello, and welcome to the Salt of the Earth podcast. I am your host, Thomas Pope, and this is my co-host person,
Jonathan Cobb.
His name is not Thomas, his name is Jonathan. This is our 20th episode. We are filming on the same day that we filmed our 19th episode.
That's not a secret.
Oh, I'm not supposed to say that?
No. But anyway, that's all good. Okay, so in this...
We can redo it if you want.
In this episode, Thomas and I are going to be talking about a youth camp that he recently went to called NYR. NYR stands for Nationwide Youth Roundup, and it's basically a bunch of churches from all over the country, mostly like the South and the Midwest and the Upper Midwest, mostly from what I've heard.
From America. And
California, but not really the East Coast. Anyway, get together in this big youth camp. And I didn't go, Thomas did go, and I thought it'd be interesting to kind of talk to him about it, or talk about it and kind of things that got away from it, and then talk a little bit about like what are the purpose and like the pros and cons to like these types of camps in general.
Yeah, so in general, like, I guess we're talking about, really we're not talking about this specific camp so much as we're talking about camps in general, I guess is how I say.
Yeah.
And my experience to this particular one, I guess, is relevant because I just got back from it. Part of the reason why we haven't done podcasts for quite a while.
Yeah.
Part of the reason, not the whole reason.
Yeah. So you just got back from it. How many like different youth camps have you been a part of?
Like different ones or like different times?
No, like different like camps you've been in. Is it just Sharon Bluff and that one?
No, I want to say probably 4 or 5 in total.
Oh, well, really?
Maybe up to 6. I'm counting like camps, youth rallies, different things like that.
Mm-hmm.
I've been to most of the ones I've been to like once or just a couple times. Some of them I've been to years and years.
Yeah. And I know that camps or youth camps, Christian youth camps can have a very wide range of Christ focus, a very wide range of a lot of stuff. Like one could be just a normal camp with a little bit of singing. Yeah, it could be a very powerful thing.
Some are very structured, some are pretty unstructured. And then they have different focuses, or some are more for fun, and some are more for spiritual growth and rejuvenation.
Yeah. So, with your experience with Christian youth camps, on the scale of like 1 to 10, how much would you say is this camp like Christ or focused on spiritual growth?
On 1 to 10.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know what a 10 exactly would look like. I'd probably put this one fairly high, though.
Yeah.
Probably like an 8 or so.
And I say there's probably a good reason to say that, because...
I don't know.
Because there was like, well, from what I heard, there was like over 100 baptisms. About 10% of the attendees were baptized.
So it's a fairly big event. There's like 1,300 people in total. Not all of those are youth. There's actually, it says its name is Nationwide Youth Roundup, but there's a lot of old people too, and people. I guess I'm kind of still a youth.
Kind of.
And there were almost 100 baptisms, so it was pretty spiritually focused. A lot of great classes, pretty much around the board. Everyone loved their classes: the teens, the adults, good speakers, pretty good worship band. There's a big chunk of the day that was just dedicated toward free time and whatever you want to do. But aside from that time, it was very, very, I'd say pretty spiritually focused.
Mm-hmm. So I've been to camps before where the Bible classes almost kind of felt like a chore. Yeah. Because that's kind of how they were perceived, or they were just kind of boring and they're kind of like an afterthought.
Yeah, where they just have like multiple in a row and... You're just kind of tired of sitting.
and they don't really put a lot of effort into finding really good teachers, or they don't have the resources to have really good teachers, or the teachers aren't really putting a lot into it.
That was not really the case here. or at NYR. There were pretty much all the messages, the main sessions were really great. The classes were really great. In fact, I had issues choosing between classes because there were multiple that I wanted to be at that were at the same time. Fortunately, I think some of them were recorded and will be eventually be released. But like, so there's like a college class, an adult class, and then like a church leaders class. And at first I was like, how am I going to choose between those? Thankfully, the college class was earlier in the morning, so I could go to that one and then a second one. But then I still have two to choose between. So it was kind of the issue of like, I really want to be at them all because they had some really good teachers. And so I struggled with choosing, and I ended up doing one thing for a couple days and then doing another thing for a couple days.
Oh, wow. Yeah. I mean, looking back on it, I wish I would have gone because this was different than like camps I've experienced in the past. From what I understand, like the you actually expect to learn stuff and grow, and the Bible classes aren't just a chore.
And you're around a lot of very knowledgeable, wise, older Christians, much more mature in the faith than me, and it's kind of like it's really nice to be around people who you can really look up to and be like Christian role models of a sort, and like give you something to aspire to, and then also kind of make you feel like, oh man, I have a long way to go. But it's so good to be around that kind of setting.
Yeah. So, one of the things I thought was probably what I would really like is they had really good music there, right?
Yeah, they had like 3 worship leaders that kind of in a band and a big stage and everything.
Yeah. See, I've never been in a church or been to a camp where they've actually had a worship band. I've actually never seen a worship band live before.
Wow.
I feel like that's one part of a big church that I would really like. I'm kind of that modern Christian.
Well, I mean, it is much. It's much better at being like drawing out emotions and things like that. Yeah. And it's definitely something that's fun for the people who like to get a little more active and mobile during worship. There's even like a mosh pit up right next to the stage. Mosh pit is a bunch of people would go up and jump around or whatever.
That's a Christian mosh pit.
Christian mosh pit.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing to think about because like I feel like there's different types of worship, but I think a good type of worship is to get really excited and to get really energetic and to get some really pumping music.
I
feel like both.
Some people don't like too emotional of worship. I think it has its balance, you know, as with everything else. Is you can be too much focused on emotion and not enough on sincerity on the actual worship itself. So, but you can go either way. In this case, is really great, and it's not strictly necessary, but it's great. And there's other ways to worship, as you mentioned.
And I think ideally you want it. I think it's good to have multiple or both, like more like thoughtful and in quiet worship, I guess, and then more energetic and exciting and emotional.
And they actually, one of the nights at NYR, they had like a late night worship session. There's like a pond there with an island in the middle, and they put a fire on the island, and so everyone is standing around the outside of the pond, and I got one of the worship leaders playing guitar, so it's like an acoustic worship late at night with this fire in the middle of the pond. And so that was a little bit more on the mellower side, and especially since as you're doing it, you know, every once in a while the leader stops because someone's coming down and getting baptized in the pond there. It's a very different, I guess, atmosphere or whatnot. And even beyond that, you know, just singing in smaller groups or in more of a smaller church kind of setting, there's a lot of ways to worship. And actually one of the speakers at NYR, See if I can find it here in my notes. He talked about worship and this. Oftentimes, I think we get a very like closed-minded view of worship. We think of, oh, if you're singing worship songs or hymns, you're worshiping, right? And we think it's just as simple as that. In all reality, I really want to find it. Well, it said something to the he said something to the effect of worship isn't music, or worship isn't singing. Music can be worship. Or in other words, the idea that just because you're singing, just because there's music, does not necessarily mean that you're worshiping. There's more to it, and I know a lot of cases it's easy to just sing along to the song, but not really be thinking about the words, not actually worshiping God. You're just singing, and there's that is something that's easy enough to fall into. And the idea of true worship is you can do it any time in a lot of ways. It doesn't have to involve music or singing.
Yeah.
Music or singing is a great way to do it, but it's not the only way to do it.
The biggest example, or biggest example, would be prayer. It's a form of worship. Right?
Yeah, prayer or just noticing and being like joyful of all the awesome things in nature around us. So many ways to worship. Okay, so I finally found it. It was right in front of me. It's from the very beginning. Another thing he said was, worship happens every time you surrender to God and humble yourself to his will. And so that's a really great idea. It kind of paralleled some thoughts I'd had in the past that worship is more than we sometimes think of it. But
so the type of baptisms that are going on at NYR would be like as close as you could see to like what the early church would have looked like with or like the day of Pentecost. Obviously, the day of Pentecost was like leagues higher than that, but like I feel like that's going to be really like powerful to witness.
It definitely was. Especially at the end of the evening messages and the songs, there would usually be what you would call an altar call, where people were called up like, hey, if you feel like there's some change that you need to make in your life, if you need to submit to Jesus, then now's the time. And so they'd kind of be called up front, and then there would be adults or the leaders of whoever that person came with would talk with them and pray with them, and then later talk and decide if baptism was the thing they were going to do. So there's kind of that preparation stage or whatever you call it. And a lot of people got baptized. I think part of me is a little skeptical because in such like an emotional environment, it can be easy to maybe make a commitment that you're not totally with, and especially if you haven't fully considered the ramifications. You haven't counted the cost really. But I think it comes down to it in the end is that it's still something to rejoice about, as many baptisms as there were, and it's really cool to see because something.
Well, yeah. Well, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, because something special about NYR, which I had never really seen before, is every time someone was baptized in the pond, which is down in like the valley, and there's kind of a mountain there, people would cheer and shout. And so even like our camp was way up the mountain, even up there, you would hear when someone was baptized from all the way up there, you'd hear the cheering and shouting, and you'd hear the people in other various camps, start to cheer along, and there was rejoicing over it, which I just kept coming back to the idea like, something about this just seems right. Not necessary, but it just seems good to be happy and rejoice for this kind of thing,
Yeah.
It's just a new light cast on baptism, I guess, for me.
And I would say this to your first note is that I'm sure the day of Pentecost was a lot of emotional baptisms too.
Yeah.
So it's it is just how it can play out a lot of times. And then our goal as Christians is to help those people afterwards.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, it's kind of something me and some of the other people with us discussed while we were there is, you know, we all thought that this was something really awesome, but at the same time we were kind of like worried, like, you know, what if, you know, they don't stick with it? And the end view I came to is, yeah, probably some of them, maybe even many of them, won't stick with it necessarily, but it's still a wonderful thing. You know, it's still something we should rejoice about, and we should now make it our effort to help them, to you know, develop strong roots in them, to make sure that they're not just rocky soil, but that they're actually good soil and they stick with it. You know, because some of them inevitably will fall away. That's true of people who get baptized any time of the year, even if it's not a super emotional, you know, youth retreat. People fall away, or people don't stick with it. That's just how it is. The fact of the matter is, some people won't stick with it, or some people will stick with it. Mm-hmm. And some of these people who were baptized there will be with it, you know, 50 years from now. And so I think, all in all, it was something. It's a good thing, and a little bit of healthy, you know, worry is good, I guess, only so far as, okay, now let's do what's necessary to make sure that we help them, you know, on their walk.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
They did something where, for everyone who was baptized, you would get a wooden stake, and you could write your name on it and the time, and then you could drive it into the ground near the pond. They actually ran out of stakes during the week. They had like 72 or something, and they ran out, and so they had to go and buy more. I don't know what the exact ending number was, but it was close to 100. So
yeah,
something to be great, to rejoice for, at least for the time being. You know, I think like Luke 15, you know, there is more rejoicing in heaven over one lost sinner who repents than over 99 righteous who don't need repentance. I think it's something we should rejoice about. It's something we should be happy about when someone decides to follow Christ. Mm-hmm. So that was a really, really great thing about this week in particular at NYR.
Yeah. And so we were talking about this briefly earlier, but it sounded like there's a lot of focus on really good teaching and preaching. I guess, was there any, like, well, let's say with the college class, for instance, is there any, how do you think that made an impact in people's life? And what was it kind of about?
So for the college class, they had a guy from Missouri who was teaching that, Peter Buckland. I don't know exactly what church or town he's from, but he preaches at a fairly large-sized church, I think, and he also has taught classes at, I want to say, Ozark Christian College.
Oh, okay.
But he has kind of background in like psychology a little bit, so he talked about like Myers-Briggs personality traits actually for a little while, and how that interrelates to us and God, essentially. And how like our own particular personalities are, you know, a small piece of the personalities of God, and how what we can do as our specific, you know, personalities and our types, what things we will naturally be good at and what things we'll naturally need to work at, and specifically in relation to ministry, to how we work in the church. And there was more than that too. There was I guess the topic of the class was spiritual formation, which is, you know, forming your spiritual roots to some degree, and
finding your gifts or your path.
Yeah, finding what particularly you're good at, and also developing spiritual habits that will keep you from stagnating and will keep you growing and reaching a maximum faith, I think is what it was referred to.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think we've talked about that on the podcast before, how different people are just naturally better at different things, and we each have our own strengths and weaknesses that are kind of connected with our personality types and other things like that.
Yeah, so we talked, so like certain personalities they're more inclined to be like preachers because they're energetic and they're good at dealing with emotions and with people. Other people, they're not going to be as naturally inclined to that. They can still do it, but it's just they're going to have to put in more effort, that kind of thing. And especially he talked about like, here's what certain people are going to struggle with, because with the Myers-Briggs personality types is you have kind of your several strengths, and then everything that isn't your strength is a weakness and is something that you're just not going to be as good at. And so he's talking about, yes, you need to grow your strengths, but you also need to grow your weaknesses, because your goal is to blend, to be as well-rounded as you can be. One thing I really liked that he mentioned was, so in Myers-Briggs there's 16 personalities, right? And he made the point that all 16 of those personalities, that is God. He is kind of the good of all of them. And then we are each one little piece of God's personality. And when you get all those personalities together as a community and they work together in unison, then you get a reflection of God. And that's what the church should be. Is all these personalities working together, each with their own individual strengths and perspectives, and you kind of get a little bit of a reflection for what God is.
That's cool.
It's a really interesting point. And it kind of opens you up to this idea of like, that it kind of makes sense, because he bring up several examples of like different times throughout the Bible where God was this particular kind of personality. He's all of them, but in certain instances he displayed one more than others. Like you could look at Jesus and you could see, there's times when he was walking around and he was just interacting with anyone he'd come across, and there were times when he was also maybe more reserved, introverted, and he would go off by himself just to process things. And so you can kind of see all of that. It's an interesting thought, for sure.
Yeah. And
so the college level class, which actually, since it was a different time than the other classes, a lot of adults sat in on as well, is about spiritual formation and on either developing roots or developing the practices necessary to keep moving, to keep growing.
And then the class that I'd probably be most interested in was the church leadership class.
Yes, it was taught by a professor at Ozark Christian College as well.
Jeff Dalrymple?
Jim Dalrymple. And he actually also has a video series on Ozark. I think you can access it free. It's about eldership and leadership in the church. And we had already seen those. We'd watched those in our church. And so I walked in and I saw him and I'm like, oh, hey. I know this guy, and he's talking about some of the same stuff, but it's in person, and you're getting it's just much better in person, and there's a ton of information. He was very knowledgeable about things. I unfortunately only sat in on I'd say 1.5 days of his class because I was at other places too, but a lot of good ideas. Let me see if I can, for the one morning I sat in his class, I got almost 2 pages of notes, which is more than I got for most things.
Oh, wow.
So and especially on the day I was there, he was talking a lot about managing with conflict in the church as leaders, and how conflict is to be expected. Not all conflict is unhealthy, but there are good and bad ways to deal with it, And sorry, you're gonna say something?
Oh, no.
So a couple of things that he mentioned in the class was he's very big on the idea that the main role, the responsibilities of elders, for instance, are not primarily physical or administrative. So when he was talking about the primary roles of elders, he mentioned, or overseers, he mentioned doctrine, discipleship, and discipline. So doctrine would be establishing and maintaining the base doctrine, this is what we believe kind of thing, and then making sure that people are kind of aligning with that. Discipleship is making sure you're bringing people and to grow them up and mature them within the church, and not just letting them do whatever, which I think we talked about in the last episode, is discipleship needs to happen. It's a thing. It's very important, and it without it, churches don't quite work the way they should.
Yeah.
And the last one being discipline in and I don't have full notes for that one, so I don't know. I don't remember entirely what he said about it, but so I'm just gonna not talk about it anymore. And another thing I thought was interesting was, like, he said the first third to 2/3 of church business meetings should be about spiritual things, and should be about how the church can better do its job of, serving Christ, making disciples, things like that. Which, hey, that sounds like a pretty good idea.
Yeah, it does.
Unfortunately, that's not often what happens. And how everything in business meetings need to be centered around Christ, essentially, or needs to be centered around the mission of the church, which also, hey, that's a really good idea. Mm-hmm. Why don't people always think of that? Unfortunately, we get so distracted that oftentimes business meetings are about various business things, and then no one ever talks about the spiritual needs of the conversation, or very rarely, and by the time they do, it's kind of too late. So I really like those ideas of, hey, everything needs to be centered on your real mission here, and every decision you make, you need to think, okay, does this serve our mission? Does this serve Christ? Or is this extra, Mm-hmm. So that was good stuff there.
Yeah. So one of the big advantages to camps like this, and as you get to, or like larger camps or rallies or whatever, is you get to hear from other people's perspectives, and you get to meet some very scholarly people like Jim Dalrymple and people like that have really studied this stuff. But anyway, kind of getting back to more like camps in general, one thing that's kind of, I can see it's both a positive and a negative in a way, is that camps are in the business of getting people into a spiritual high that obviously is temporary. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of a very interesting thing to think, or like thing to wrestle with, because it's like, how do you deal with that? Like, do you have anything to say? Or
deal with it as in, like, what?
Well, it's, or how do you, I guess, do you just rationalize, or do you just realize that this is just a temporary thing, and I'm going to feel this way, and then it's just going to be gone? Or do you try to...
So, with that kind of thing is, the life and definitely our journey as Christians is very much a journey of peaks and troughs. There's no way to get around it. There's times when you're going to feel like you're doing great, and you're feeling like you're really growing, and you can feel the way God is really moving in you. And then there's times when you get down, maybe you made a mistake, or you're just having trouble with something, you're not doing well, and then you'll just keep going up and down. That's just kind of the way things naturally go, whether or not you go to rallies or camps like this. Now, camps, I would say, are usually a very large peak compared to what you normally are going through, is because you are exposed to, like you said, very, mature scholarly Christians, usually people who know what they're talking about and are very good at articulating it better than I am, than most people are. And so you're getting exposed to, also you're just spending a lot more time, thinking about and learning about spiritual things than you would on your normal daily basis. So you naturally kind of get a spiritual high. I would kind of say one of the main benefits of it is I would describe it as a spiritual detox. Is with these things, oftentimes you're getting away from the world, from your the normal busyness of your life, and you are in this case, out of cell signal. You can't use technology, really. You are on the mountain with God, so to speak, because we were on a mountain. So, and it's just really good to put aside all the world for a while and then focus much more on spiritual things. Mm-hmm. And it's a spiritual detox that kind of cleans your system. And then when you go back, it's not going to last forever. It's not going to last forever, but it's so nice to have that.
Yeah.
And to have, kind of the encouragement and up boost. It's kind of like a spiritual growth booster. It speeds things up. It's not going to keep you going at that speed, but it may jolt you and get you moving in areas that you haven't been moving in a while. May help you in a few areas, and that's kind of the way I see it.
Yeah, it's a good perspective.
We've talked about it in the past of like, what if we spent more time on spiritual things all the time, like at rallies or camps.
Yeah.
Where like every day you were spending, like, at these, like, for instance, at NYR, there's 2 messages and 2 worship things a day, and then there's a class, or in my case, there's 2 classes. And so that's all, that's 3 or 4 hours of your day right there spent on spiritual things. Your average day for almost everyone isn't that.
Yeah.
And so you may go to Sunday, and Sunday will maybe have 1 or 2 hours combined, and then you go through the rest of your week. If you go to church on Sunday, that's maybe all you get. So we've talked about in the past about what if you had more and you kind of created the environment of a rally or church camp in your normal life. Mm-hmm. And it's a good thought question. I haven't tested it out, but there's something to be had there, even if the more time per day you're spending is just your own personal time in prayer and studying the word, that's something every day. Mm-hmm. And so when you go to a rally, it's temporary. It could be wondered, what if there's a way where it wouldn't be so temporary? I don't know. I'd have to test it sometime.
Yeah. I definitely can see the benefit of, even though it is temporary, to go, just because it is kind of, for the reason you said, it's kind of like a cleanse. Mm-hmm. It kind of gives your mind, breaks are healthy. Break from this world.
And something that multiple of the speakers talked about is once you leave, within a few days or a couple of weeks, most people will go back to a lot of their old patterns. And so there is some effort that has to be made to retain what you learned and to actually make it a part of yourself, which is one reason why I took so many notes, 25 pages, plus a bunch of handouts, is because, like, I'm sitting there thinking, like, oh, this is good stuff. I do not want to miss this. And midway through, I was like, man, I wish I could just hit pause and process all of this and then resume and then go through the rest of the week. Unfortunately, I don't have the power to control time. But I wish I could have more time to process it so I wouldn't lose any of it. And I inevitably will lose some of it. But if I spend the time to process it and I don't, just forget it all, it will be beneficial.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so things like this, I highly recommend. It can't necessarily, it's not something that, like, you can rely on as, like, the way to, keep growing spiritually. Is even if you go to a lot of events, there's going to be a lot of time beside that. The purpose of these events is not the events themselves. It's to help you the rest of the time when you're not at the camp or the rally or whatnot. It's to give you what you need to teach you how to keep moving on your own after you're not around all the great speakers and teachers.
Mm-hmm. So it is an interesting thing to think about, because I think it is beneficial, even though we acknowledge this is a temporary thing. Mm-hmm. But I guess it's kind of like a vacation in a way. A vacation is obviously temporary, but it's still beneficial.
You don't stop going on vacations just because the vacation will end.
Well, I've thought about it.
Maybe you do, but the point is there's some perceived or actual benefit during it that makes it worthy, even though it is temporary. Everything's temporary.
Yeah, and something I was thinking about, they didn't really have this. There's not really examples of this before, like modern Christianity that I can think of, but there are some similar things, like in the early church, where they basically had celebrity preachers, like Peter and Paul, that went around.
They had apostles going around, and a lot of that kind of stuff is you just don't know what it was like because it doesn't mention a lot of it.
Yeah.
They could have very well had similar things. They also lived very different lives than we do.
Yeah. Well, but I guess I was thinking about, like, when, was it Peter or Paul, that the guy fell out of the window? They were up till like 2 a.m. or something.
Paul.
And I was thinking that's kind of like a similar thing, because if they're up to 2 a.m, I think they were on like a spiritual high of sorts.
Well, he was preaching all the way through the night.
In order for that to happen, if you know what I mean. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I guess there are biblical, like, similar examples to kind of what this type of thing.
Yeah, and you look in like the first few chapters of Acts and how they were constantly meeting together and devoting themselves to the apostles' teaching and to prayer is a similar kind of idea to what we were thinking about, like, as in, what if it was constant, what if it wasn't just a one-time thing? They were making their lives something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So that's another example of something like this.
Yeah. And something that I've thought about doing is making some form of mission work a part of my regular yearly routine. And yeah, it's just a good thing to think about. Like, it's very hard to sustain a spiritual experience like this on a regular basis, but you could incorporate it into a large part. You could incorporate it into at least a large part of your life.
Mm-hmm.
Like even maybe a month.
Right. I think thinking of it as in like you have to maintain this constant spiritual thing or high or whatnot is a wrong way of thinking about it, because it can't be achieved. You're never going to feel like you're doing great all the time or that you're learning super fast all the time. It's just not how things work. There's highs and lows and
slow times and fast times.
Slow times and fast times.
Yeah.
They both come. The highs end, the lows end, thankfully. It's not any one moment that you're looking at. It's the general trajectory, which is the important thing. Are you continually on an upward path? That's what you should be focusing on.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, this brings... So yeah, as we were talking about earlier, a lot of different youth camps have different like levels of spiritual like focus, and this one I think is on the higher end of that. And it seems like there's also a lot of youth camps that are kind of dying out right now. And
yeah, and one issue is with a lot of different camps is they're passed around within whatever churches like have gone to them in the past or fund them or whatnot, and there's usually not a lot of outreach to get people from new churches to come. And that's even the case with NYR to some degree. It's such a big thing that plenty of people are still able to hear about it. But in a lot of cases, these groups are fairly isolated, and so it'll be isolated to like a few groups of this particular kind of church in this section of this state. Those are everyone who go,
Mm-hmm.
Word isn't got out, and definitely better job could be done on that part. Another issue is some camps, they strive a lot more to be fun places.
Mm.
And when you're trying to be fun and not so much on the spiritual benefit, then unfortunately you're never going to be quite as fun as just a secular summer camp that has all of its focus on fun.
Yeah.
Because you're gonna stick people in services and classes, and that's not quite as fun. So camps that focus too much on fun, then I could see that being as a potential reason why they might peter out a little bit. In this case, there was a lot of fun. There's a big period of free time, and there's volleyball and all sorts of other games. But most of the organized activity of NYR was the messages, was the worship, was the classes, was the group time at night. And that's what made it so great, in my opinion, is the focus, their attention was put on those things and not on, how can we have more fun?
Mm-hmm.
There's still plenty of fun, but that's not what they were focusing.
So it does seem like as church or future church leaders probably focus on events like this is a very beneficial thing.
I'd say so.
Yeah.
I'm at least sold on NYR.
Yeah.
And it's just the specific example that we're talking about in this case, but
there's a lot of different things like this.
There's a lot of good. I've gone to lots of good ones in the past. I find especially ones that are maybe focused a little bit more on college age or older teen people. They tend to do much better in some ways, like spiritually, because the ones that are more, or at least in part, for kids, they can't they can't do the same level of depth that things more focused on older ages are, which I'm an older age now. I guess there's need for people, younger people,
mm-hmm.
classes and their specific things, but college age ones I've been to have been deeper generally. And so it's something I definitely suggest, because we all need a spiritual detox. We could use a lot more of it. It's just life usually doesn't allow it, or we would have to make major changes. And maybe we need to make major changes eventually to our lives. But in the meantime, going to a week of a camp or a youth rally or something is a great way to reevaluate things,
mm-hmm.
to be rejuvenated spiritually.
Yeah, and then different things. I think one of the biggest ways to have a more permanent or thing like this would probably to get into mission work is another way to get these spiritual highs. And there's different programs for that. Like you could, like temporary mission trips or like 2-year or whatever.
Which often have very profound effects on the people who go to them, especially like teens going on their first mission trip or something, and they come back with totally new perspectives.
Mm-hmm.
And I think ultimately the goal is you're working in your daily life, right? Whether or not you have, all sorts of events and church gatherings every single day, your goal should be kind of doing missions work every day, which, get to that point, and then you're always riding some form of a high. Not totally always on the top, but you're doing what you were meant to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So
this has kind of been a discordant, disorganized conversation about camps and about
highs.
About highs. We're talking about getting high. And about what's good about them, and then a few specific things about NYR and things I learned there particularly. Again, it's not really specific to that. We're really, in total, more talking about camps in general, I think.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of benefit to them. I don't know what else to say. There's a lot of benefit to them.
Yeah. Definitely think it should be consider making it a part of your routine or part of your yearly routine
of growth.
It's another way to grow as a Christian, to become more salty.